US Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent will skip next week's meeting of finance ministers as well as central bank governors from the group of 20 countries in Cape Town here in South Africa. The decision to miss the regular gathering of finance leaders from the world's largest economies, the G20, is highly unusual, particularly for a US Treasury Secretary, as the United States often leads G20 agreements on financial as well as monetary policy matters. For more on the story, joining us now is US correspondent Simon Mark. Simon, we don't get Marco Rubio. Now we're not getting the Treasury Secretary. How bad is this?
I think it's bad. There's no question about that. I mean, there are some suggestions here that Scott Bessent, the new Treasury Secretary, has decided to remain in the United States because he wants to attend Donald Trump's first cabinet meeting, which would be taking place at the same time as that meeting of G20 finance ministers. And one can understand why he would want to be at that first cabinet meeting. But equally, you could understand why it would be a draw to travel to South Africa, because it would be his first opportunity as Treasury Secretary to rub shoulders with many of the international finance ministers with whom he will now be dealing on a daily basis, including finance ministers from Europe, from China, from Russia, and from other G20 member states. So it is certainly raising eyebrows here that a Treasury Secretary this early in his tenure is taking the unprecedented decision to skip a meeting of G20 finance ministers designed partly to pave the way for the agenda at the full G20 Leaders Summit to be held in South Africa in Johannesburg in November. Now, Scott Bessent has not commented publicly on these reports, so there's been no statement from him or from the Treasury echoing what we heard from Marco Rubio, the Secretary of State, when he announced that he was going to skip tomorrow's meeting of foreign ministers because he was embracing the falsehoods promulgated by President Donald Trump at the White House over the Expropriation Act. Donald Trump, of course, arguing that expropriation of land from white farmers is taking place in South Africa. South African authorities and others, of course, argue that it is not happening, even though it could, theoretically, under the terms of the Expropriation Act. So we don't know whether this is an ideological move that Scott Bessent is taking, or a pragmatic political move because he wants to attend Donald Trump's first cabinet meeting, or maybe it's a bit of both. You carry favour with Donald Trump by both attending the cabinet meeting and deciding that you're not going to travel to South Africa for that G20 finance ministers meeting. But certainly it raises fresh questions about whether this American government might be preparing for a full-scale boycott of the G20 summit in South Africa when world leaders are supposed to gather there at the end of the year in November.
Ultimately, it doesn't look as though there's much cooperation in trying to find a solution to the problem. Would that be a fair assessment here? Because if you're not getting the international relations minister, Marco Rubio, you're not getting the Treasury Secretary as well here in Mr. Bennett, then clearly no communication at all is ultimately happening, no clearing of the air, and can't thaw any of the issues that are currently at play here.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it is pretty extraordinary to see the absence of dialogue. And as far as we can tell, there is no meaningful dialogue taking place. Remember that President Cyril Ramaphosa, and through his spokesman, announced that he was going to send a delegation to Washington, D.C. to make representations to the Trump administration and, of course, to members of Congress on Capitol Hill about the situation that is actually occurring in South Africa, as opposed to the situation that the White House and the State Department claims is occurring. Remember also that President Trump offered refugee status for Afrikaner farmers that had had their land expropriated. And of course, AfriForum turned around and said that they had noted President Trump's offer, but that Afrikaner farmers themselves, at least those allied with AfriForum, had no desire to leave South Africa and would not be taking the United States up on an offer that was made, of course, at a time when the Trump administration separately is engaging in mass deportations at a very rapid clip. No delegation has been announced by the South African government to travel here. Indeed, we were hearing earlier in the week that efforts by the South African embassy in Washington, D.C. to establish dialogue with people close to Donald Trump in the president's inner circle was going nowhere at all. And really, I think the arrival of a delegation here would have to be the starting point now of putting anything back together, especially since American cabinet ministers, plural, are now saying they're not traveling to South Africa for these routine G20 meetings.
So earlier on you spoke about this possibly being a boycott as well then of the G20. Does this ultimately mean that the US is ultimately boycotting primarily the biggest economies in the world, in essence?
I mean, it is so difficult to know what they plan to do here. They haven't said they're going to boycott the entire G20 World Leaders Summit later this year, and that obviously would be a stunning step for President Trump to take. But when you put all of this in the context of everything else that is happening today, a break between Donald Trump and the Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky, Donald Trump now arguing that Ukraine is to blame for the Russian war against it, describing Volodymyr Zelensky as a dictator, further enraging America's European allies who already feel as though the White House has completely shut them out of efforts to try and bring peace that President Trump is leading, at least in conversations with the Russians, even though Ukraine hasn't yet secured a seat at that particular table. Donald Trump has wondered aloud about the possibility of readmitting Russia into the G7 and turning it back into the G8. That's going to be extremely controversial with America's partners in the G7. So as President Trump stakes out this new isolationist redefinition of American foreign policy that really seems to be emphasizing that he's getting much closer to Russia than the United States has been in recent times. Who knows what the plan is for G20, which Donald Trump, of course, is supposed to be presiding over here in the United States next year, which is why, if he's not in Johannesburg in November, even the handover wouldn't be in a position to take place.
Simon Marks, appreciate that update. It's going to be an interesting one over the next couple of years indeed with the Trump administration and relations with the rest of the world. Appreciate it this evening.